Tonight, we at the Forbidden Dispensary open a cabinet that has been locked for longer than memory. Inside are not just remedies and warnings, but stories, remarkable lives, improbable endurance, and a fight that began long before we even had a name for the thing stalking us. You might picture white coats and bright discoveries. Most of history did not look like that. Most of history looked like darkness, like desperate guesses, like prayers spoken low because speaking them out loud felt like tempting fate. To live honestly in that world was to face an enemy you could not see, could not name, could not bargain with, and could not strike. So before you settle in, if you genuinely enjoy what we do here, keep close and tell us where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. We always find it strange and wonderful how many doors this voice slips under. Silence the pings. Let your shoulders drop. Breathe like you mean it. And let's begin where this story always begins. Not with a bang, but with a whisper trapped in bone. In the quiet dust of ages, the disease was already at work. Not with banners, not with spectacle. More like a patient artisan carving its signature into the framework of life, leaving a mark that would outlast names and empires. Picture a wide emptiness in Wyoming some 53 million years ago. There are no hospitals, no languages we would recognize, no human hands to hold another human hand, only wind and time and animals that do not know they are early chapters in our own book. Then, much later, paleontologists lift fossilized vertebrae from the ground, remains of an early primate small enough to fit inside a modern imagination like a fragile thing. And inside that ancient bone sits the telltale lesion, a petrified sphere of abnormal growth, a tumor. Even in the dawn of mammals, the emperor was already placing a claim. But it becomes harder to keep this story at a distance when the evidence moves closer to our own bloodline. Travel with us to a cave in South Africa where scientists, modern people with modern lamps and modern tools, examined a fossilized foot bone from a human relative who lived 1.7 million years ago. The bone bore unmistakable violence, the aggressive work of bone cancer, a growth that does not politely stay in its lane. That ancestor walked the savannah with it, felt it, a gnawing pain that did not resolve, swelling, a limp that changed the rhythm of life and marked them out. They had no vocabulary for rebellious cells or errors in the body's script. No concept of a mutation, no thought of invisible mechanics. It was simply pain, a curse, darkness growing within. And here is where we at the Forbidden Dispensary pause, because this matters. This was not a disease of factories, of smokestacks, of city living, of modern sins. It was older than civilization. It was a vulnerability stitched into complex life itself. The price of being made of many cooperating parts is that sometimes a part forgets the deal. The whisper grows louder as we drift down the river of time to the Nile, to an age of pharaohs and pyramids, when people learned to preserve their dead with a devotion so precise it became, unknowingly, a gift to the living. The ancient Egyptians left more than gold masks and carved stories. They left bodies. In the late 19th century and early 20th century, archaeologists and physicians began to unwrap mummified remains not only as artifacts, but as archives. Some used early X-rays. Some used careful dissection. They peered into bodies that had been silent for 3,000 years. And there it was again, a tumor in a pelvis, a skull marked by the punched-out holes of metastatic spread, the kind of cruel signature that says the disease did not remain local, it traveled. A warrior king preserved by permafrost in Siberia, carrying a prostate tumor that likely caused private suffering long before public ceremony. These silent witnesses confirm a truth that refuses to go away. The enemy's credentials are ancient. It did not arrive with modernity, it traveled with us. But to find the first words and attempt to grapple with this thing in ink and thought, we have to reach for a scroll of papyrus uncovered near Luxor in the 19th century. It is known as the Edwin Smith Papyrus, dating to around 1600 before the Common Era, and believed to be a copy of a text roughly 1,000 years older. It is not a spell book, not a plea to gods. It reads like something startlingly modern, clinical, rational, surgical. Its author lays out 48 medical cases, organized from head to toe. Many include a diagnosis, a prognosis, and a treatment. Bind a fractured arm with splints. Maneuver a jaw back into place. Practical instructions for a world that did not yet have microscopes, but did have eyes and hands and the desire to solve. Then we arrive at one case, the one that changes the tone of the room. The text describes bulging tumors on the breast, cool to the touch, hard, spreading under the skin like something alive that refuses to be reasoned with. The physician examines, diagnoses, and then, when it is time to offer a prognosis, he delivers one of the most chilling lines medicine ever wrote. There is no treatment, an ailment not to be treated, an admission of helplessness that does not try to disguise itself with ceremony. 3,500 years ago, an unknown Egyptian doctor looked upon the face of cancer and recognized it as an unconquerable force. He did not recommend poultices, incantations, or prayer. He recommended nothing. A quiet, profound, terrible wisdom. For centuries, this was the reality, the disease as a shadow, unnamed dread, a thing people spoke around instead of speaking of. It took a Greek physician, one whose influence still haunts language, to give the enemy a name. Hippocrates, living in the 4th and 5th centuries before the Common Era, insisted disease was not divine punishment, but a natural process, an imbalance within the body. He observed tumors, hard, invasive, and threaded with veins that radiated outward. And a metaphor seized him. The swollen vessels looked like legs. The mass looked like a body dug into sand. A crab. He called it karkinos, the Greek word for crab. Later, a Roman writer translated it into Latin, and the name we still use was born, cancer, a simple name from a simple observation, one that captured the disease's creeping grip, a name that would echo through the next 2.5 millennia of confusion, despair, and eventually defiant battle. With a name, the enemy became a concept, something that could be theorized about, something that could, at least in imagination, be understood. But the map drawn for this new territory was tragically wrong. The shadow of Hippocrates was long. The shadow of the man who followed became an eclipse. His name was Galen of Pergamon, a Greek physician working in the Roman Empire during the 2nd century. Brilliant, arrogant, a tireless self-promoter, and so prolific that to disagree with him later became less a debate and more a scandal. Human dissection was forbidden, so Galen learned anatomy from apes and pigs, then poured that knowledge into a system so complete, so internally consistent, it hardened into gospel. For the next 1,500 years, to question Galen was not merely to be wrong, it was to be ridiculous. Galen took the theory of the 4 humors and made it a prison of logic. Blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health was balance, sickness was imbalance. And cancer, he declared with absolute certainty, was caused by an excess of black bile. On the surface, it sounded elegant. Tumors were often dark, hard, grim-looking. When Galen examined them, he saw clotted black material. What else could it be, he reasoned, but congealed black bile? He even wove personality into it, claiming the sadness and depression of cancer patients were not reactions to a devastating illness, but symptoms of the very imbalance that produced the disease. Melancholy attracted melancholic humor, and the loop closed on itself with a snap. A perfect system, unassailable, and wrong. So began the long reign of black bile. For an age and a half, the war was not against a cellular rebellion, but against a phantom fluid. To cure cancer, physicians believed they must purge the body of the offending humor. The treatments were brutal and useless. Purging, vomiting, bloodletting, starvation diets that forbade certain foods and praised others like charms. Picture a patient in medieval Paris or Renaissance Florence wasting away from an unseen growth. They are brought to a physician educated in the finest universities, a man who can recite Galen as if it were scripture. He nods gravely. Diagnoses excess black bile, begins the assault. The patient is bled, purged, starved. Their body, already under siege, is struck again. Friendly fire from medicine. The tumor continues indifferent. If the patient weakens, the physician doubles down, convinced the black bile is simply stubborn. When the patient dies, the theory is not questioned. The treatment was late, they say. The imbalance too deep. The system is foolproof. Its failure reinforces itself. Generations fought an imaginary enemy while the real one spread unseen through living bodies. There were dissenters, voices in the wilderness, but dogma is a comfortable blanket, and people do not like being told their ancestors have been wrong for more than 1,000 years. Still, a crack eventually appeared in the wall, not from a new theory, but from a new way of seeing. The Renaissance did not just revive art, it revived curiosity, a willingness to look at the world as it was, not as old texts insisted it should be. And the revolution began on a cold slab in Padua. A young Flemish anatomist named Andreas Vesalius, born in 1514, became a professor at an age when most people are still learning how to stand inside their own confidence. Anatomy lectures then were theatre. The professor perched high, reading Galen aloud, while a barber surgeon dissected a human body below like a stagehand. Vesalius found it absurd. He set the book aside, came down from the chair, took the knife into his own hands, looked for himself, and he discovered again and again that the human body did not match Galen's description. The jawbone was one piece, not two. The liver did not carry the lobes Galen promised. The sternum did not divide the way the old authority insisted. In 1543, at the age of 28, Vesalius published a monumental atlas of anatomy, illustrated with a precision the world had not seen. He did not solve cancer. That was not his project. He did something more foundational. He broke the sanctity of authority and replaced it with the authority of direct observation. Do not trust the book, trust your eyes. And with that, the old war, fought with ghosts, began slowly to turn toward the real enemy. Vesalius gave the world a true map of the body, but it was still a map of the healthy. Knowing the streets of a city does not tell you where the fires will start, or how they spread, or what they leave behind. To map the geography of disease itself, medicine needed someone with patience, bordering on obsession, someone willing to follow a human life all the way to its ending, and then keep looking. That work fell to an Italian physician named Giovanni Battista Morgagni, a methodical mind who spent decade after decade in Padua, the same intellectual air Vesalius had once disturbed. Morgagni did something deceptively simple and quietly radical. He refused to let symptoms remain a mystery floating in the air. He listened to patients in life, their complaints, their pains, their strange new limits. And when those patients died, with permission, he performed autopsies. He correlated what a person had felt with what the body held. In 1761, at the age of 79, he published the culmination of his life's work in a massive multi-volume book on the seats and causes of disease as investigated by anatomy. He described nearly 700 cases, a racing heart matched to a damaged aorta, seizures and paralysis matched to a growth pressing on the brain. Again and again, he demonstrated the same truth, like a hammer tapping the same nail. Disease has a seat. Cancer was not a free-floating imbalance of humors. It was not black bile pooling in melancholy corners of the body. It was a lump in a breast, a lesion in a lung, a growth in a stomach, a tumor that could be pointed to, held in a hand, weighed, described. This was not just a medical shift, it was a philosophical one. Morgagni dragged cancer out of the realm of vague theory and anchored it to physical reality. And once cancer became a local mechanical problem, a new idea crackled through the minds of surgeons, who until then had been treated as craftsmen. Necessary, yes, but not truly intellectual. If the enemy had a location, why not remove it? This is where the war began to change its posture. Less prayer, more steel. One of the most influential voices of this new aggressive approach was a Scottish surgeon working in London in the late 18th century, John Hunter. Hunter believed cancer often began locally, and if caught early, could be excised, completely removed. But he pushed against timidity. He argued that cutting out just the lump was too gentle, too optimistic in the wrong way. You had to cut wide, cut deep, remove the tumor and a margin of healthy tissue around it, the way you might fell a tree and still dig out the roots so it cannot return. This was the dawn of surgical oncology, the first real attempt to fight back in a way that was not purely symbolic, but understand what this meant in practice. We at the Forbidden Dispensary don't romanticize it. Early cancer surgery was not clean, it was not quiet, it was not merciful. Operations were performed without anesthesia. Patients were held down by straps, by assistants, by desperate family members, while the knife did its work. There was no understanding of germs. Infection was rampant and often fatal. A successful operation could still be a delayed death sentence delivered by the wound itself. And yet, this is the strange, brutal truth: some people survived. For the first time in recorded history, some cancers were actually cured, purchased at the price of pain and disfigurement. It was crude warfare, but it was warfare against something real. Still, an even deeper question haunted the room. What exactly was being removed? What was a tumor made of? What was its nature? Vesalius had mapped the healthy body. Morgani had mapped the diseased organs. But the origin of the enemy, its fundamental identity, remained hidden behind the limits of human sight. The answer waited in a world too small to see. And the key was a new instrument, the microscope. For centuries, lens grinders and curious amateurs had peered into drops of water and found life where none was suspected. By the 19th century, microscopes became powerful enough to explore tissue itself. A new universe opened, one that made organs look like landscapes and blood look like weather. In the 1830s, German scientists proposed a radical unifying idea. All living things, plant and animal, are built from fundamental units called cells. The body was not a continuous fabric. It was a crowded society, trillions of cooperating citizens. This was the context in which a towering figure arrived. Rudolf Virchow, a physician, anthropologist, and politician in Berlin. Virchow took cell theory and sharpened it into a blade. He declared a principle in Latin that would change biology forever. Every cell arises from a pre-existing cell. No spontaneous generation, no mysterious ooze birthing new tissue out of nothing. Cells came from cells, dividing and reproducing according to rules. Then Virchow turned his microscope on cancer. Where others saw chaos, he saw a perversion of order. He saw cells, distorted, misshapen, disorganized, but unmistakably cells. And if cells only come from other cells, then these malignant cells must have come from normal cells. This was the intimate horror. Not an invading parasite, not black bile, not a foreign deposit. It was us. Cancer was not a monster crawling in from outside the walls. It was a civil war, a rebellion from within the body's own society. Virchow described it as cellular anarchy, citizens that had forgotten the law and begun multiplying without limit, building a malignant empire inside the legitimate state of the body. With that single insight, the black bile kingdom finally collapsed. The real enemy had a face, and once you know what you're fighting, the war changes. It becomes less like superstition and more like strategy. Still brutal, yes, still imperfect, but pointed. The 19th century operating theater, before the Great Silencing, was a place of frantic carpentry. It was a soundscape of animal terror. The patient awake and strapped down would scream. Students would watch from tiered seats, faces caught between fascination and dread. A good surgeon was not delicate. A good surgeon was fast. Speed was mercy. A race against shock and blood loss, with a fast amputation held up as proof of mastery. Cancer, in that setting, was a formidable opponent. A growth to be cut out. But cutting often killed. Even if the patient survived the blade, they might die days later from the invisible enemy. Infection, hospital gangrene. Rot that crept into wounds and turned healing into decay. The battlefield itself was contaminated. Then, in Boston, everything changed. On a crisp autumn morning in 1846, at Massachusetts General Hospital, a dentist named William T.G. Morton administered sulfuric ether to a patient. The surgeon, John Collins Warren, removed a tumor from the man's neck, and the patient did not scream. When it was over, Warren looked out at the stunned audience and said, "Gentlemen, this is no humbug." Anesthesia was born. The first shackle broke. The surgeon was no longer a sprinter. Time became possible. Craft became possible. Precision became possible. But time alone did not solve infection. The second liberation came from Glasgow, Scotland, from a surgeon named Joseph Lister, who was thinking hard about the foul stench of the surgical ward and reading the work of a French chemist named Louis Pasteur. Pasteur had shown that fermentation and decay were caused by microscopic organisms, not spontaneous generation. Lister made the connection. Those invisible organisms were killing surgical patients. So Lister began spraying carbolic acid, used to treat sewage, into the operating room, onto instruments, onto wounds. The effect was staggering. Mortality dropped, antisepsis arrived, the clean war began. With the silence of anesthesia and the safety of antisepsis, surgery entered a new era. Surgeons could now be bold, methodical, and aggressive. And in the United States, a new kind of surgical general rose, a man who embodied both genius and darkness, William Stewart Halsted at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore. Halsted demanded discipline and near silence in the operating room. He pioneered rubber gloves, initially to protect the hands of his scrub nurse, Caroline Hampton, from harsh sterilizing chemicals. He later married her. He trained a generation of elite American surgeons. He also lived much of his adult life as a functioning cocaine and morphine addict, a secret born from self-experimentation with cocaine as a local anesthetic. He guarded it fiercely with the same control he brought to his work. Halsted looked at breast cancer and saw engineering. The prevailing belief was that cancer spread outward from its original site, moving through contiguous tissue and then marching up chains of lymph nodes. To Halsted, removing only the lump was like trimming a weed and leaving the roots. So he devised a terrifyingly absolute solution: remove the whole territory in one unbroken piece. The procedure, an en bloc resection, became known as the radical mastectomy. It removed the entire breast, the underlying chest muscles, and the lymph nodes of the armpit. It was anatomical violence executed with technical mastery. It left many women disfigured, with chronic pain and swollen arms from disrupted lymph drainage. And yet, in an era with few options, it was seen as heroic salvation. Some patients lived, some were cured. For decades, Halsted's radical operation became not just a procedure, but the procedure, the gold standard, the symbol of surgical audacity. The operating theatre became a battlefield where victory was measured in how wide the margins were, in how much tissue could be removed before the body surrendered. But the scalpel had limits. Sometimes, even after the most extensive operation, cancer returned, not at the scar, but in the lungs, the liver, the bones. It reappeared like a ghost in a distant room of a house you thought you'd cleared. This was a terrifying clue. The centrifugal theory was incomplete. Cancer was not always a stain spreading through cloth. Sometimes it behaved like a seed caught on the wind of blood and lymph, capable of traveling far and taking root elsewhere. Surgeons had been fighting a land war against an enemy that could fly, so the war needed a weapon that could reach beyond the blade. And as the 19th century bled into the 20th, that weapon emerged not from an operating room, but from a physicist's laboratory, born by accident, carried by invisible force. In the late autumn of 1895, in Würzburg, Germany, a physicist named Wilhelm Conrad Röntgen was experimenting with electrical currents in a glass tube. He covered the apparatus in black cardboard, yet he noticed a faint green shimmer from a nearby screen coated with barium platinocyanide. Something invisible was leaving the tube, crossing the air and striking the screen. He held up his hand and saw the ghostly silhouette of his bones. He called them X-rays, the X for unknown. Within a year, hospitals were using them to find bullets and set bones. Even shoe stores used them as spectacle. The world fell in love with a new kind of sight. Then people noticed another truth. Those who worked with unshielded tubes developed burns, blisters, hair loss, destruction as a side effect of seeing. A young man in Chicago began to wonder whether that destruction could be aimed. If the rays burned healthy skin, could they burn away a cancer? In early experiments, physicians exposed tumors to the invisible beam. The first attempts at radiation therapy were crude and dangerous, but the idea was born. You could attack cancer without cutting. At the same time in Paris, another discovery unfolded in damp, cold rooms, where a scientist named Marie Curie, with her husband Pierre, pursued radiation with an endurance that bordered on myth. They processed tons of ore to isolate elements that seemed to glow with impossible energy. They named one for Marie's homeland, and then they found another, far more powerful: radium. Doctors realized radium could deliver intense radiation directly into tumors. They inserted small sources close to or inside cancers, shrinking and sometimes eradicating them without surgery. It felt like a new kind of magic, but it was a treacherous ally. Early pioneers did not understand the long-term dangers. They handled radium with bare hands, carried it in pockets, tested X-ray tubes by looking at their own bones under the beam. Marie Curie's notebooks remained dangerously radioactive. She herself would die from a blood disorder tied to exposure. Many early radiologists died of cancers they spent their lives trying to treat. They were the first martyrs of the atomic age. Still, their work opened a second front. Now there was surgery for what could be cut and radiation for what could be burned. Two weapons, both local, both powerful only when the enemy stayed put. But metastasis remained the great unsolved problem. Disease scattered through the body where no knife could reach and no beam could safely cover everything. To fight that, medicine needed a systemic weapon, a chemical that could travel the bloodstream like a hunter, searching for malignant cells wherever they hid. And that chemical would come from a place as bleak as any chapter in human history, the industrial killing fields of war. The world did not invent chemotherapy in a clean room. It did not arrive with a ribbon cutting or polite applause. It crawled out of a trench. The first clue came as a foul, greenish-yellow cloud drifting over fields in Belgium during the First World War, an era when human cruelty discovered new efficiencies. Poison gas was designed not only to kill, but to maim, blind, and terrify. Among these weapons, mustard gas was especially insidious, oily, lingering, faintly scented like garlic or horseradish, and eager to burn whatever living tissue it touched. Mustard gas blistered skin, ravaged lungs, and stole sight. But when pathologists performed autopsies on the dead, they noticed something else, something specific and strangely consistent. Bone marrow was shrunken, lymph nodes were wasted away. The poison seemed to have an appetite for rapidly dividing cells, particularly those in the blood and lymphatic systems. It was a grotesque observation, filed away in medical literature like a splinter under the skin. Painful, memorable, and not yet understood. It lay dormant for decades until the world prepared to destroy itself again. In the late 1930s, as another global conflict gathered weight, the United States began quietly preparing for chemical warfare. The government commissioned two pharmacologists at Yale, Louis Goodman and Alfred Gilman, to study mustard agents. Officially, their work aimed toward defense, antidotes, countermeasures, treatments. But to defend against a poison, you first have to understand how it kills. They worked with a stable variant called nitrogen mustard and confirmed with chilling clarity what the Great War's autopsies had hinted. Nitrogen mustard could annihilate white blood cells. It was catastrophic to tissues where cells divide quickly. And in a quiet laboratory, Goodman and Gilman made an intellectual leap that still feels like a dangerous prayer. What is cancer, if not uncontrolled cell division? What is lymphoma, if not a rebellion of the lymphoid system, the very tissue mustard gas seemed to target? What if a weapon of war could be repurposed into medicine? It was almost unthinkable to treat disease by deliberately poisoning the patient, carefully, strategically, hoping the cancer would suffer more than the body that carried it. The chance to test this came in 1942 at New Haven Hospital. The patient was a man recorded only as J.D., a 48-year-old silversmith dying of advanced lymphoma. His tumors were massive, compressing airways, blocking veins, colonizing his body. Radiation had failed. There was nothing left. Under secrecy so tight the drug was called only by its codename, Substance X, Goodman and Gilman, working with surgeon Gustav Lindskog, began intravenous injections of nitrogen mustard. The response was stunning. Within days, the tumors softened and shrank. The man could eat again. He could lie down. It was as if the cancer, so arrogant, so certain of victory, was suddenly being dissolved from the inside by an invisible chemical tide. The remission looked like a miracle. But miracles in this war often come with an invoice. Nitrogen mustard did not only strike malignant cells, it struck the bone marrow, the body's blood factory. White cell counts collapsed. The treatment had to stop, and when the chemical pressure lifted, the cancer surged back. J.D. died fewer than 100 days after the treatment began. Still, his brief remission proved a principle that would change medicine forever. A drug could travel the bloodstream and push back a systemic cancer. Because this work was bound up in wartime secrecy, the results remained classified for years. The public world did not get the story in the way it deserved. Instead, it received a second demonstration, large-scale, undeniable, and soaked in tragedy. A year later, in the port of Bari, Italy, an Allied-held city crowded with ships and supplies, German bombers struck in a surprise attack. The harbor burned, ships sank. Hundreds died. One ship, the SS John Harvey, carried a top-secret cargo, thousands of bombs filled with mustard gas, intended only for retaliation if chemical warfare escalated. In the chaos, those bombs exploded. A cloud of sulfur mustard mixed with oil and smoke drifted over the water and into the city. Sailors were pulled from contaminated water. At first, their injuries seemed like burns and blast trauma, but in the days that followed, a medical mystery unfolded. Men died with a profound absence of white blood cells. Their immune defenses were stripped away, leaving them unable to fight what the world normally fends off without thinking. The Allies panicked, desperate to keep chemical weapons secret. They sent Lieutenant Colonel Stuart Alexander, a chemical weapons expert, to investigate. Through meticulous autopsies, he identified mustard poisoning. His report became a grim trove of human data, large-scale evidence of systemic bone marrow suppression. The Bari disaster was a horror, but it also sealed the truth. Mustard agents could devastate the very systems from which many blood cancers arise. So from humanity's impulse to poison one another on an industrial scale came a third pillar in the war against cancer: chemotherapy, a paradoxical medicine, healing forged from death. Now the arsenal had shape: surgery to cut, radiation to burn, chemotherapy to poison systemically. The strategy grew more complex, less naive, but it was still early. The chemicals were blunt, the knowledge was shallow, the victories were fragile. And then, in the quiet, sterile corridors of a children's hospital in Boston, the war took a turn that still makes the air feel different when you say it out loud. In the mid-1940s, childhood leukemia was not treated as a fight to be won. It was managed like an inevitable timetable. A child might arrive with fever, bruises, bone pain, a limp. Signs that the blood itself had turned, and within weeks, sometimes days, they would be gone. The care was palliative, comfort measures, transfusions, gentleness in the face of certainty. There was no talk of cure, barely talk of battle. Into that world walked a pathologist named Sidney Farber. A pathologist is often described as a doctor for the dead, more at home with glass slides than living voices. Farber was meticulous, stern, driven. He performed autopsies on children who had died of leukemia, tracing the disease's total invasion, organ after organ, marrow to liver to spleen, as if the cancer had rewritten the entire child. And something in him refused the prevailing shrug of inevitability. He could not accept that this was a law of nature. He decided it was only a problem whose solution had not yet been found. Farber began thinking not like a mourner, but like a mechanic. Cells, healthy or malignant, need certain nutrients to divide. One of the critical ones is folic acid, essential for making DNA. Without it, replication stalls. He learned of a grim observation: giving folic acid to leukemic children could accelerate the disease. The malignant cells feasted, counts exploded, children died faster. It was a terrible lesson, but Farber heard an inverted possibility inside it. If folic acid helps the cancer, then blocking folic acid might starve it. He needed an antifolate, an imposter molecule close enough to fool cellular machinery, different enough to jam it. Farber reached out to a chemist, Yelapragada Subbarao, whose team had synthesized such compounds. One was aminopterin, a potent antifolate. In 1947, Farber gathered terminally ill children, those with weeks to live, with nothing left to lose. He began injections. The early days were harrowing. Aminopterin was poison. Mouth sores so severe children could not eat. Hair loss. Dangerous suppression of bone marrow. Colleagues muttered that he was torturing children on a half-formed theory. But Farber did what pathologists do. He watched the cells. Day after day he drew blood, made slides, stained them, and counted the enemy. Then, in a boy named Robert, one of the first children treated, the leukemic blasts began to fall. Not politely, not gradually. They plummeted, the fever broke, bruises faded, energy returned. Under the microscope, where malignant cells had once been a solid sheet, normal marrow began to reappear like grass pushing through ash. A remission. Temporary, yes. The leukemia returned, often resistant, and the children ultimately died. But in those remissions, Farber proved something that no one had been able to prove before in a way that could not be dismissed. A chemical could push back a systemic cancer. He had opened a door that had been sealed for millennia. And Farber understood that his small victory, a few months stolen back from an otherwise immediate death, was not an ending. It was the first word of a longer book. Turning fleeting remissions into real survival would require resources, coordination, and will on a scale medicine had never seen. The quiet pathologist became something else. A crusader. He saved the letters from parents, gratitude braided with grief, in a locked file cabinet he called his sentimental safe. He began to think beyond the hospital ward, beyond Boston, beyond what science could do alone. He prepared to go to Washington. Because in America, after the Second World War, a particular kind of confidence hung in the air like electricity. This was a nation that had split the atom, built highways, and was already dreaming about the moon. There was a belief, sometimes arrogant, sometimes necessary, that any problem could be solved with enough resources and enough stubborn will. Cancer, however, remained a specter spoken of in whispers. The word itself was treated like a curse. It was the disease people avoided naming, as if naming it invited it to dinner. Farber knew that to build a war chest, he had to change the language. He had to transform cancer from private shame into public enemy. And he found an ally as formidable as any chemical. A New York philanthropist and political operator named Mary Lasker, fueled by personal loss and rage at the primitive state of research funding. Together, Farber and Lasker formed an alliance that would bend American policy. He brought scientific authority, she brought strategy, publicity, and power. They learned how to sell urgency without selling lies. They worked the press, they produced pamphlets and advertisements. They framed the fight as a war America could win. They helped create the Jimmy Fund in Boston, giving the disease a child's face and a human voice, turning abstract horror into something the public could love and protect. Donations poured in, institutions grew, and then they aimed higher, the federal government itself. But that, our forbidden shelves tell you, is where the story gets louder, stranger, and more political than most people expect. When Sidney Farber walked toward Washington, he was not carrying a cure. He was carrying something more dangerous in politics than certainty, a glimpse of possibility. Post-war America was swollen with confidence. This was a country that had taken the unimaginable and turned it into engineering. Atoms split. Oceans crossed, machines built at scale. The national mood suggested that any problem, no matter how ancient, no matter how intimate, could be solved if you threw enough money and talent at it. Cancer did not fit that story. Cancer was spoken of in euphemisms, like a family secret. It was a long illness. It was a growth. Obituaries avoided the word, like it might contaminate the ink. The diagnosis was often delivered in paternalistic hush. The patient's job was to endure. The doctor's job was to decide. The disease lived inside silence. Farber understood that to change the science, he had to change the culture. To fund the laboratory, he first had to pull cancer into daylight and make it say its name. He did not do it alone. Mary Lasker, wealthy, politically savvy, relentless, had watched her husband die of colon cancer and decided that the nation's indifference was an outrage. She believed, almost religiously, that medical research could be accelerated with the same focus that built weapons and sent men into orbit. She was a master of framing, not "this is complicated, but this is urgent," not "we are learning, but we can win." Farber was the sober scientific voice. Lasker was the engine. Together they ran one of the most effective lobbying campaigns in American medical history. They built coalitions, they courted journalists. They fed the public stories of promise and need. They pressured politicians with a mix of data and raw human narrative. They treated cancer not as tragedy, but as adversary. something that could be opposed, named, and fought. Their momentum grew year by year, pushed forward by allies in Congress and by a public that was beginning to hear the word cancer more often and to fear it more sharply, now that it was being spoken out loud. By the late 1960s, the timing was perfect in the way timing is sometimes cruel. The Vietnam War was eroding faith in government, a technological quagmire that made Americans hungry for a different kind of national project. Something clean, optimistic, morally uncomplicated. And after the moon landing, the country was looking for a new mountain to climb, a new proof of competence and destiny. Lasker and Farber offered one, a war on cancer. They wanted a massive, centrally directed program on the scale of the Manhattan Project or Apollo, something that would not only fund research but organize it, something with a deadline and a victory parade. This vision sparked a fierce debate among scientists. Many researchers feared that a top-down mission would crush the curiosity-driven basic science that often produces the most important breakthroughs. They preferred the peer review culture of the existing research institutions. They were wary of declaring a war without fully understanding the enemy. But political momentum is not built from caution. The public was galvanized, reports were issued, committees formed. A target date for a cure was floated. America's bicentennial, 1976, as if the disease could be scheduled and defeated like an infrastructure project. In the White House, President Richard Nixon saw an opportunity. He needed a popular domestic initiative that could cut through national turmoil. Few things are as politically untouchable as the promise to cure cancer. Who would publicly oppose it? So in late December of 1971, Nixon signed the National Cancer Act into law. It did not create the fully separate conquest agency Lasker wanted, but it dramatically expanded the National Cancer Institute. The director would be a presidential appointee with a direct line to the White House. Funding surged, buildings went up, laboratories multiplied, a cottage industry became a national enterprise. A wave of optimism rolled across the country. The war had been declared, but there was a problem, one that medicine always seems to learn too late. The loudness of a declaration does not change the complexity of the enemy. America had mobilized against a force it still did not fully understand. And while the new money poured into better drugs and improved radiation techniques, a quieter revolution was unfolding in basic science, one that would recast cancer not as a single thing to be attacked, but as a fundamental error in the code of life. For decades, one leading suspect had been viruses. The idea had deep roots, reaching back to the early 20th century, when a researcher found that a tumor in chickens could be transmitted by a filtered extract, cell-free fluid that still carried the ability to cause cancer. Only something smaller than bacteria could pass through that filter. A virus. For a long time, this was treated like a strange poultry quirk. But by the 1960s and 1970s, with more cancer-causing viruses discovered in animals, the viral theory gained traction. It was appealingly simple: cancer as infection. Find the virus, make a vaccine, defeat the invader. The new war funding flooded into virology labs. Scientists hunted for the human equivalent of those animal viruses as if it were hiding behind the next door. In California, at the University of California, San Francisco, two virologists, Harold Varmus and J. Michael Bishop, were deep in this hunt. They were not clinicians, they were basic scientists, driven by curiosity about how cancer-causing retroviruses worked. They focused on a famous viral gene known to trigger tumors, a gene called SRC. Their plan was elegant and technically precise: create a radioactive DNA probe that would bind to the viral gene, then use it to find where the virus inserted its cancer gene into the host's genome. The experiment worked. They could locate the viral gene inside infected cells. Then they did what good scientists do. They ran controls. They tested the probe on DNA from healthy, uninfected chicken cells. The logic was simple: no virus, no SRC. The probe should find nothing. The result should be blank. But the probe lit up anyway. The gene they believed belonged to the virus was already present in normal chicken DNA. They repeated it. Again. They tested other species. They kept finding versions of the gene in ducks, turkeys, fish, and eventually in humans. The viral cancer gene was not a foreign invention. It was stolen. The virus had kidnapped a normal cellular gene and, in the process, altered it, damaging it, breaking its regulation, turning a useful tool into a weapon. The implications were explosive. Cancer was not primarily an invasion from outside, it was betrayal from within. These genes, now called proto-oncogenes, were not bad by nature. They were essential components of normal cellular life. They were part of the machinery that tells a cell when to grow and divide. The accelerator pedal. In the virus, that accelerator was jammed to the floor. Soon, other researchers identified more oncogenes in human cancers, genes whose damaged versions drive malignancy. And just as importantly, scientists found the other half of the system: tumor suppressor genes. If oncogenes are stuck accelerators, tumor suppressors are brakes. These genes normally stop cell division when something is wrong. They order repairs. They trigger cellular self-destruction when damage is too severe, a process with a name that sounds gentle until you understand it. Programmed cell death. When tumor suppressor genes fail, the brakes fail. This reframed cancer as a process rather than a single event. A gradual accumulation of genetic errors. A cell needs multiple hits, accelerators stuck on, brakes broken and other systems compromised, before it can break free of normal constraints and become truly malignant. It also explained why cancer tends to be a disease of aging. It takes time for one unlucky cell to collect enough mistakes. The war on cancer, declared with such optimism, now faced a more unsettling reality. How do you kill an enemy that is a distorted version of yourself? How do you attack a malignant cell without also harming the healthy cells it resembles? The enemy was not foreign. The enemy was written into our own biology. This was not a border war. It was a civil war fought at the level of genes. And at the same time as this genetic revolution was rewriting textbooks, a different front was opening, one that had nothing to do with microscopes or legislation and everything to do with smoke in the air. Because while scientists chased viruses and genes, the most preventable cause of cancer was already everywhere. Ordinary, ritual, accepted. Tobacco. By the mid-20th century, lung cancer had surged from rarity to epidemic. Doctors saw it constantly, men and women with hacking coughs, shadows on X-rays, bodies shrinking as if the disease were eating them from the inside. Researchers in Britain decided to investigate with a new kind of rigor. Medical detective work built from statistics and relentless interviewing. They compared lung cancer patients to similar patients without lung cancer, asking about life details, jobs, neighborhoods, habits. And one correlation rose out of the data with the weight of a physical law. The lung cancer patients smoked heavily. Across the Atlantic, American researchers found the same. They even painted tar distilled from cigarettes onto mice and watched tumors grow, translating correlation into biology. The evidence hardened into something the tobacco industry could not defeat with science, so it chose a different weapon: doubt. They issued public statements designed to reassure, to muddy, to delay. They funded research that looked everywhere except the obvious link. They argued correlation was not causation. They suggested personality, genetics, urban life, anything but cigarettes. This was modern warfare, not bullets, but perception. The battlefield was the human mind. Still, the data kept accumulating. Long-term studies followed thousands of people for decades. Patterns became undeniable. Eventually, the United States government issued a landmark report stating that cigarette smoking causes lung cancer. It did not end smoking overnight. It began a siege: warning labels, advertising bans, public smoking restrictions. A slow cultural shift that turned a universal ritual into a contested habit. The war of prevention had won its first major campaign. And here is the quiet victory most people forget to celebrate: the cancer that never happened. But even as prevention advanced, something else began to crack: the silence around the disease itself. Patients started to refuse the old role of passive suffering. They began to demand information, voice, and partnership. They began to organize. And that, our forbidden shelves tell you, is where the story shifts again, away from presidents and microscopes and into the hands of the people most affected. For most of history, the cancer patient was treated like a silent figure in a play written by someone else. The diagnosis arrived in hushed paternalism. The plan was dictated, not discussed. The role of the person living inside the catastrophe was to comply and endure. Even the language made a cage. Cancer was the big C. It was a growth. It was a long illness. Families hid it like shame. Obituaries stepped around it. The silence isolated patients from one another, robbed them of community, and made every private fear feel like a personal failure. Then, in the latter half of the 20th century, the walls began to crack. The first tremors came from a different epidemic entirely. In the 1980s, AIDS tore through communities with a brutality that the wider culture was slow, tragically slow, to acknowledge. Young people died fast. Government response moved like molasses. The medical system, bound in procedure and prejudice, did not bend easily. So patients and their allies bent it. Groups like ACT UP learned the science, the clinical trial language, the regulatory machinery. They staged protests that were loud enough to be impossible to ignore. They demanded faster drug approval pathways and compassionate access. They insisted that the people whose lives were on the line had a right to sit in the rooms where decisions were made. The cancer world watched and understood something essential. Deference was not a law of nature. Breast cancer activism became the clearest expression of this new power. For decades, breast cancer had been wrapped in cultural taboo. Women often entered surgery not even knowing whether they would wake up with their breast. Consent forms gave surgeons broad permission, an old system that treated women as bodies to be managed rather than people to be consulted. And the standard operation, still echoing Halsted's legacy, was frequently disfiguring. Even as evidence accumulated that less radical surgery could be just as effective for many patients, the old dogma held on through habit and hierarchy. Then women began forming support groups, not as politics at first, but as survival. They compared stories, they compared scars, they compared what doctors had and had not told them. And slowly, what began as comfort became a movement. Organizations formed with a new tone, not pity, but action. They learned lobbying, they learned budgets, they learned how to speak to Congress in the language Congress respects. Funding, voters, urgency, optics. They demanded research dollars, accountability, and representation. They pushed into grant review panels. They pressed the Food and Drug Administration to modernize access for patients with metastatic disease, people who could not afford the luxury of waiting for perfect data while time ran out. They changed the culture in three lasting ways. First, they accelerated how promising drugs could reach patients, reshaping approval pathways and access programs. Second, they made cancer research funding politically durable. Third, and most intimate, they changed the doctor-patient relationship. People were no longer expected to be passive victims. They became survivors. They demanded charts, explanations, options, second opinions. The old paternalism began to erode. But in the clinic, a hard truth remained. The main weapons were still blunt. Chemotherapy and radiation were indiscriminate by design. They killed rapidly dividing cells. The problem was that the body contains plenty of rapidly dividing cells that are not cancer. Hair follicles, gut lining, bone marrow. The so-called cure often looked like a wager, whether the poison would kill the cancer before it killed the patient. For decades, oncologists and patients dreamed of a different weapon, a true magic bullet, something that would strike the malignant cells and spare the rest. The dream began to solidify as the 20th century neared its end, not through poetry, but through genetics. This time, the story opens in Philadelphia, in a drab laboratory where two researchers in the early 1960s stared at chromosomes from a patient with chronic myeloid leukemia, CML. CML is a strange disease. It can begin slowly, with overproduction of white blood cells, but it tends to progress into an aggressive fatal phase. It was relentless, and for most patients, it was only a matter of time. The researchers noticed something odd. One specific chromosome was consistently shorter than expected, a small stunted piece that kept appearing like a calling card. They named it after their city, the Philadelphia chromosome. For the first time, a specific genetic abnormality had been consistently linked to a human cancer. It was monumental, and for years, deeply mysterious, a clue without a motive. The motive arrived later with better genetic tools. Scientists discovered the Philadelphia chromosome was not simply missing material. It was a translocation, an exchange. A segment from one chromosome broke off and swapped places with a segment from another. This accident fused two genes into a new hybrid. That fusion gene produced a rogue enzyme, a tyrosine kinase, stuck in the on position, constantly signaling the cell to divide. It was as if the cell's growth switch had been welded permanently upward. Suddenly, CML was no longer an abstract leukemia. It was an engine with a name. And if cancer is driven by an engine, you can imagine a wrench. A young oncologist and researcher became obsessed with the idea of blocking that specific enzyme. He believed cancer treatment could be rational, designed around a molecular vulnerability rather than delivered as a broad chemical firestorm. He found partners in industry chemists who were building and testing compounds designed to inhibit kinases, work many considered impossible to make specific enough to be safe. One compound emerged as unusually promising. In the laboratory, it did not merely slow CML cells, it killed them while leaving healthy cells largely unharmed. This was the magic bullet taking shape, but a laboratory result is not a human life. Between a petri dish and a patient lies a gulf made of money, regulation, and fear. Pharmaceutical companies hesitated. CML was not common. Developing a drug is expensive. Many thought the whole one pill, one target idea was fantasy in a field built on chemotherapy. Still, a small clinical trial began in the late 1990s, enrolling patients with advanced CML who had failed other options. These were not hopeful cases. These were the people medicine had already begun to say goodbye to. They began taking a small orange pill. And then something happened that oncology was not used to seeing. Responses that looked clean. White blood cell counts fell back to normal. Enlarged spleens shrank. Under the microscope, the cells carrying the Philadelphia chromosome disappeared from the marrow. And the side effects, compared to traditional chemotherapy, were astonishingly mild. No predictable hair loss, no constant nausea. People went back to work, they played with their children, they lived. The drug was approved with unprecedented speed. CML, once a near-certain death sentence, became for many a manageable chronic condition controlled by a daily pill. But the deeper significance was larger than CML. It proved the concept of targeted therapy, that if you understand a cancer's specific molecular driver, you can design a drug that hits that driver with precision. It changed what hope could mean in a clinic. And it did something else. It made the war smarter. Less brute force, more intelligence. Less carpet bombing, more sabotage of the enemy's power supply. Yet even as targeted therapy rewrote one leukemia's fate, another truth was rising in the background, something older and more intimate than any pill. We had overlooked an ally that had been patrolling our bodies since the first vertebrates swam in ancient seas: the immune system. For most of the 20th century, the orthodoxy said the immune system was blind to cancer because cancer is self. The immune system attacks what is foreign, not what is born inside. A tumor, the logic went, could hide in plain sight because it wasn't truly other. But there were heretical whispers, cases and observations that did not fit the neat story. Long before anyone spoke about T-cells and checkpoints, a New York surgeon in the late 19th century noticed something strange. A cancer patient whose inoperable tumor regressed after a severe bacterial infection with high fever. It was as if the body's furious fight against infection had accidentally burned down the cancer too. The surgeon tried to harness that. He deliberately provoked immune responses using bacterial mixtures. Dangerous, unpredictable work that sometimes killed patients and sometimes produced astonishing remissions. The medical establishment moved on. Radiation and chemotherapy were cleaner, easier to standardize, easier to believe in. The immune idea was dismissed, pushed to the margins, treated like an embarrassing relic. But it did not die. It slept. And in the late 20th century, basic immunology began to wake it up. Scientists studying T-cells, the immune system's elite assassins, mapped the accelerators and brakes that control immune attacks. They found molecules that act like checkpoints, preventing the immune system from destroying the body's own tissues. Then came the pivotal suspicion. What if cancers exploit those brakes? What if the immune system does see the tumor, sends T cells toward it, and the tumor simply presses the brakes, forcing the attack to stop? If that was true, then the solution was not to boost the immune system blindly. It was to cut the brake lines. Checkpoint blockade. In animal studies, blocking a single checkpoint led to tumor eradication so dramatic it looked like stage magic. Translating that into human medicine took years of skepticism, failure, and persistence. But eventually, trials in advanced melanoma, one of the deadliest, most treatment-resistant cancers, produced something oncology had rarely witnessed. Not just response, durable response. Patients with metastatic disease, told to prepare to die, saw tumors vanish and stay gone for years. Not everyone, not even most, but enough to change the field forever. Another checkpoint pathway was discovered and targeted, leading to drugs that worked in multiple cancers, including some lung cancers once considered nearly hopeless after chemotherapy failure. A fourth pillar took its place beside surgery, radiation, and chemotherapy: immunotherapy. The idea that the body's own ancient army could be unleashed, not with vague stimulation, but with precise removal of suppression, reshaped oncology's imagination. And yet, as the applause rose, reality settled its weight again. Immunotherapy was not a universal cure. Many cancers barely responded. Some patients suffered severe autoimmune complications. Some tumors adapted and escaped. The emperor had not been dethroned, only forced to retreat in certain battles. Which raised the next and most sobering question: why do these breakthroughs work so spectacularly for some and fail completely for others? The answer lives inside the tumor itself, not as a single uniform enemy, but as a chaotic ecosystem. And that is where our next shelf opens. The hardest lesson in this war is not that cancer is strong, it is that cancer learns. For a long time, people spoke about cancer as if it were one enemy, one uniform army marching under one flag. That illusion was convenient for storytelling and deadly for strategy. It let us believe in a single decisive weapon, a single breakthrough, a single cure that would roll like thunder across every type and every body. Then we looked closer, and what we saw was not one enemy. We saw a city. A tumor under a microscope is not a neat clone. It is a sprawling, chaotic metropolis of cellular diversity. An ecosystem made of millions upon millions of cells, all descended from one malignant ancestor, but continuing to mutate and evolve. Some grow faster, some are better at recruiting blood vessels. Some hide better from immune patrols. Some, by sheer random chance, carry changes that make them resistant to whatever weapon we choose next. This is tumor heterogeneity, and it is not a footnote. It is the main reason victories slip through our fingers. When chemotherapy is given, it creates a flood of lethal pressure. Billions of cancer cells die, scans improve. The doctor may declare a response, the patient may breathe for the first time in months, but if even a tiny handful of cells in that original tumor happen to possess a mutation that lets them survive the chemical tide, those survivors inherit the cleared landscape. The competition is gone. Space and nutrients open up, and the survivors multiply. The relapse arrives, and the relapse is not the same disease you treated before. It is a hardened veteran, composed largely of the cells that proved themselves fit under fire. The drug that worked the first time can become useless. We are not just fighting cancer, we are, in a grim way, training it. This is Darwinian evolution playing out at high speed inside a human body. Survival of the fittest, compressed into weeks and months. The same story repeats with targeted therapies. A targeted drug can hit one crucial driver, an enzyme, a receptor, a pathway, and the tumor can melt with almost insulting speed. But somewhere inside that diverse population is a subclone that has already found a detour. Another pathway, another switch, another method of growth. Under the pressure of treatment, the detour becomes the new road. The cancer returns, smarter. It repeats with immunotherapy too. Sometimes a tumor is visible to the immune system because it displays certain mutated proteins. Unleash the T cells and they kill what they can recognize. But a subpopulation of cells may stop displaying that target, or may cloak itself in different immune suppressive signals, or may shape the microenvironment into a swamp that T cells cannot cross. The cancer returns, hidden. So the enemy is not one king in one castle. It is a shifting horde, a distributed insurgency, and the landscape matters as much as the enemy itself. A tumor does not grow alone. It corrupts its neighborhood. It builds an ecosystem around itself called the tumor microenvironment, and it is not passive soil. It is active architecture. The tumor sends chemical signals that coax the body into building new blood vessels to feed it. It recruits immune cells not as attackers, but as protectors, turning the body's own agents into corrupted guards. It lays down dense fibrotic tissue like a fortress wall, making it physically harder for drugs to penetrate and for immune cells to enter. Fighting cancer is not like removing a stone from a field. It is like trying to uproot a poisonous vine from a swamp, where the vine has already persuaded the soil and water to help it. But the most terrifying challenge, the one responsible for the vast majority of cancer deaths, is not the primary tumor at all. It is metastasis. The lump in the breast, the mass in the colon, the shadow in the lung. Those are often only the original camp. The killing is done when the disease travels and establishes colonies. Metastasis is the emperor's logistical masterpiece. At some point in a tumor's development, a few cells acquire the ability to break away. This is not easy. Most cells that detach die. The bloodstream is violent. The immune system patrols. Sheer physical force tears cells apart. To metastasize, a cell must become an escape artist and a survivor. It must slip out of the primary site, invade nearby tissue, enter blood or lymph, survive the journey, evade immune attack, then exit into a distant organ and begin again, building a new colony in foreign territory. And this is not random. An English surgeon in the 19th century described it with an image that remains painfully accurate: seeds and soil. The cancer cell is the seed. It can only grow where the environment is hospitable, the right soil. That is why certain cancers prefer certain destinations. Why colon cancer so often finds the liver. Why breast cancer favors bone. Why lung cancer commonly reaches the brain. The body is not one uniform landscape. It is many distinct ecosystems, and the seed takes root where it can. Once metastases are established, the war changes shape. It becomes a guerrilla war fought on multiple fronts across the entire body map. You can cut out the primary tumor, but how do you remove microscopic nests already planted elsewhere? You can radiate a lesion in one spot, but you cannot safely radiate every potential hiding place. Chemotherapy can reach everywhere, but resistance is always waiting somewhere in the population. The emperor does not need every cell to survive. It only needs a few. It sacrifices billions to chemotherapy, the way an empire spends soldiers. It sends out colonists by the thousand, knowing only a handful must succeed for expansion to continue. And the longer the war runs, the more opportunities the disease has to adapt. So here is the uncomfortable truth we at the Forbidden Dispensary keep on a high shelf, because it makes people angry. Many of the old strategies will never be enough on their own. One-size-fits-all poisoning cannot reliably defeat a heterogeneous, evolving ecosystem. Even the refined beauty of a single targeted therapy can be outmaneuvered by diversity and mutation. Even immunotherapy, miraculous for some, fails when the tumor builds a micro-environmental fortress or learns a new disguise. To fight an enemy this personalized and this adaptive, our response must become equally personalized, equally intelligent. And that brings us to the frontier, a shift from reaction to anticipation. From finding cancer after it has built a fortress to detecting it when it is still a whisper. The first major strategic shift is intelligence gathering. For most of history, we detected cancer when it became large enough to feel, large enough to cast a shadow, large enough to hurt. By then, it may already be diverse, already metastatic. The dream is earlier detection, stage 1, stage 0, the point where the disease is still local and simplest. This is where a technology called the liquid biopsy enters the story. Even small tumors shed bits of themselves into the bloodstream. Fragments of mutated DNA, cellular debris, molecular messages packaged into tiny vesicles. For decades, this was invisible noise. But modern sequencing has become so sensitive that we can detect these traces, needles in a haystack. The promise is unsettling in its simplicity. A routine blood draw, analyzed for circulating tumor DNA, could reveal a cancer's presence long before a scan shows anything. It might even suggest what kind of cancer it is and which mutations drive it. This is not merely a new test, it is a new posture. Constant surveillance, microscopic spies reporting treason at the earliest hint. But seeing the enemy earlier only matters if we have weapons precise enough to exploit that advantage. Which brings us to the second shift, precision tools that rewrite biology rather than burning it down. Here, the story points toward gene editing, molecular scissors that can be programmed to find a specific DNA sequence and cut it. It gives humanity a frightening kind of agency over the source code of life. In inherited cancer risk, you can imagine correcting dangerous mutations before cancer ever forms. In active cancer, you can engineer immune cells to be better killers. Edit them so tumors cannot shut them down, or equip them with receptors that recognize cancer targets more effectively. This is where cell therapies come in. Living drugs made from a patient's own immune cells, trained and modified outside the body, then returned as enhanced soldiers. In certain blood cancers, results have been nothing short of astonishing. Deep remissions where nothing else worked. The challenge is translating that power into solid tumors, where fortress microenvironments and physical barriers complicate everything. And then there is the third shift, managing complexity itself. Modern cancer generates oceans of data, genomic sequences, protein patterns, pathology slides, imaging, immune profiling, treatment histories. The human mind is brilliant, but it is not built to compute millions of variables at speed. So medicine turns toward a new kind of analytic partner, artificial intelligence. Algorithms can be trained on massive archives of pathology, learning patterns that predict aggressiveness and metastatic risk. Models can integrate genomic profiles with drug response databases to recommend combinations tailored to a specific tumor's vulnerabilities and likely escape routes. The goal is not replacing the oncologist, it is augmenting, giving the human doctor a weapon suited to the scale of information the disease now demands. And with all this comes a quiet rethinking of what victory means. For decades, war on cancer implied unconditional surrender, total eradication. But some cancers may never be eradicated in every case because the vulnerability is woven into life itself. Perhaps the future is not always conquest, but control, turning cancer into a chronic condition managed by early detection, rapid intervention, and tailored pressure applied just enough to keep the disease contained. A durable truce, a house arrest inside the body. The emperor not slain, but disarmed and watched. But this is not a comforting conclusion, not yet. Because even the tools of the future come with limits, ethical knots, unequal access, and the brutal reality that biology does not care about our timelines. Which raises the last question, one we keep for the final shelves. What does it mean to live in a world where cancer is both ancient and intimate, where we may never fully escape it, but might learn to outsmart it often enough to reclaim life? Here's the part people don't like, the part that makes a room go quiet even when the lights are on. Cancer is not only an event, it is a property of being made the way we are made. A body built from trillions of cells must grow, repair, and renew itself. That means cells must divide, and anything that divides long enough under the wear of time and the friction of environment will eventually make mistakes. Most mistakes are harmless. Many are corrected. Some are lethal to the cell that makes them. A few, rare, unlucky, and perfectly timed, create advantage. And advantage is what cancer is. Not evil, not intention. Advantage. So the frontier is not a single cure that ends the story. The frontier is strategy. How to catch advantage early, how to deny it fuel, how to steer it into containment, how to keep a person alive and whole while the biology remains imperfect. This is where modern oncology begins to look less like a duel and more like surveillance and counterintelligence. Seeing the enemy before it has a name. For most of history, the war began when the tumor announced itself. A lump, a cough that would not stop, blood where blood should not be, pain that arrived like an eviction notice. By then, the disease may already be heterogeneous. It may already have scattered seeds. It may already be a map with multiple red circles. So the modern obsession is earlier detection. Not only earlier than last year, but earlier than symptom. Earlier than a scan can reliably see. Earlier than the fortress. This is why the promise of the liquid biopsy is so electric. Tumors shed, even small ones. They shed fragments of DNA and RNA, proteins, signals, little molecular scraps that drift into the bloodstream. The problem used to be that we could not hear the whisper over the roar of everything else the body releases. Now sequencing can detect trace material at breathtaking sensitivity. It can identify mutations that should not be there. It can distinguish patterns that suggest a tumor's tissue of origin. It can, in theory, raise a flag while the cancer is still a small cluster, before it becomes an ecosystem. But the Forbidden Dispensary doesn't sell fantasies without reading the label. Earlier detection creates new problems, even as it solves old ones. It raises the question of overdiagnosis, finding abnormalities that might never have harmed a person in their natural lifespan, then treating them aggressively anyway. It raises the anxiety of false positives. It raises the issue of what to do when a blood test says something is happening, but imaging can't yet localize it. So the future is not just about detection, it is about interpretation. It is about deciding when to act, how hard and with what, which pushes medicine towards something it has historically resisted. Personalization that is real, not rhetorical. Treating the specific disease, not the general category. We at the Forbidden Dispensary keep returning to the same uncomfortable point. Cancer is not one thing. Even within one tumor type, there are multiple molecular subtypes, different engines, different vulnerabilities, different behaviors. So the new standard increasingly is not lung cancer or breast cancer as a single label. It is the genetic and immune profile. It is the driver mutations. It is the microenvironment. It is whether the tumor is inflamed or immune deserted. It is the set of levers the disease depends on. Precision medicine is not a slogan. It is an attempt to stop guessing. A tumor biopsy becomes more than a pathology report. It becomes a molecular inventory. What switches are stuck on, what breaks are broken, what repair pathways are missing, what signals the tumor is using to recruit blood vessels, what immune cloaking mechanisms it has learned. And then, ideally, treatment becomes a tailored combination, less like choosing one weapon and more like setting multiple traps. Not because medicine wants complexity, but because the enemy is complex. Engineering the body's own army. If targeted therapy was the first true molecular magic bullet, engineered immunity is the idea of making bullets that learn. The immune system already has the machinery to detect abnormality. The problem is that tumors evolve ways to evade, suppress, or exhaust that machinery. Checkpoint inhibitors work by removing some brakes, but not all tumors depend on those brakes, and not all immune systems respond the same way. So researchers began to ask a different question. What if we don't just remove the brakes? What if we upgrade the soldiers? This is where cell therapies enter as something almost unsettling in their intimacy. Immune cells can be taken from a patient, modified outside the body, expanded into an army, then infused back in. In some blood cancers, engineered T cells have produced remissions that look impossible on paper. Disease vanishing after everything else failed. But solid tumors are a different battlefield. Blood cancers are accessible. Solid tumors are fortified. They have physical barriers, corrupted microenvironments, immunosuppressive chemistry, and sometimes very few clear targets that can be attacked without harming normal tissue. So the modern push is to solve multiple problems at once. Make engineered cells better at trafficking into tumors. Make them resistant to exhaustion. Make them less vulnerable to suppressive signals. Combine them with other therapies that remodel the tumor microenvironment so immune cells can enter and persist. This is not one trick, it is system design. Editing biology at the level of code. Then there is the tool that still sounds like science fiction, even when it is already in laboratories: gene editing. Molecular scissors that can be programmed to cut specific sequences and, with the right guidance, repair or rewrite them. The obvious dream is prevention in people with inherited high-risk mutations, correcting the risk before cancer arises. The nearer-term reality has more to do with engineering immune cells, editing them so they can't be shut down as easily, so they persist longer, so they recognize targets more cleanly. The promise is extraordinary, the risks are also extraordinary. Off-target edits, unintended consequences, ethical boundaries about what should and should not be edited. unequal access that turns biology into another axis of privilege. The Forbidden Dispensary does not pretend these questions will be solved by optimism. They will be solved by governance, by transparency, by trials, by failures honestly reported, and by a public that understands the stakes, the information flood, and the need for new intelligence. All of this, liquid biopsies, genomic sequencing, immune profiling, imaging, creates a problem that is less biological than mathematical. The data is too large. No single clinician, no matter how gifted, can hold the full combinatorial landscape in their head. Even teams struggle. Every patient becomes a library of variables. So medicine turns toward a new kind of analytic partner. Machine learning systems trained to recognize patterns in pathology slides, imaging, molecular profiles, and outcomes. These systems can help with tasks like identifying subtle patterns in tissue architecture that correlate with aggressiveness, predicting which therapies are likely to work given a tumor's mutations and immune profile, suggesting combinations designed to prevent likely resistance pathways, monitoring longitudinal data to detect recurrent signals earlier than human pattern recognition might. The goal is not replacing a physician, it is giving the physician a second brain that can compute at scale. But here too, the Forbidden Dispensary keeps a sober ledger. Algorithms inherit biases from data. They can amplify inequities if training sets underrepresent certain populations. They can appear confident while being wrong in unfamiliar cases. So the future requires not blind trust, but rigorous validation and human accountability. Redefining victory. All of this finally drags us toward a question that has been waiting behind the war metaphor for decades. What if winning does not always mean eradicating every last malignant cell? What if, for many cancers, the realistic goal is control? If cancer is a property of complex life, then perhaps the most achievable victory is to detect early, treat precisely, suppress recurrence quickly, and keep the disease from establishing metastatic empires. A life lived with surveillance, yes, but also a life lived. Cancer as a chronic condition for many, not a sudden ending. A durable truce, maintained by intelligence and rapid response. This is not surrender, it is strategy. It is the difference between dreaming of a final battle and building a stable peace. And yet, because we don't sell endings that aren't earned, we have to admit what remains unresolved. Even with the best tools, metastasis still outpaces us too often. Heterogeneity still breeds resistance. Some tumors remain stubbornly cold to immune attack. Some cancers are discovered late because of biology, access, or chance. And the future's most advanced therapies are still unevenly available, concentrated in certain hospitals, certain countries, certain income brackets. Which means the last shelf we open, the final part, is not just about science. It is about what it costs, who gets it, and what it means to keep fighting an ancient adversary without lying to ourselves. So here we are at the last shelf, where the glass is a little thicker and the labels are written smaller. Because what's stored here is not just information, it's meaning. From the fossilized vertebrae in Wyoming, 53 million years back, to the footbone in South Africa, 1.7 million years ago, this story has been telling us the same thing in different languages. The enemy is ancient, and it is intimate. It is not a modern curse. It is not a punishment for convenience. It is a vulnerability braided into the bargain of complex life. We watched the ancients recognize it without tools. An Egyptian physician wrote the most honest prognosis imaginable, an ailment not to be treated. No theater, no false comfort, a quiet admission that the world could not yet fight back. We watched Hippocrates name it after a crab, giving the dread a shape that would follow us for 2.5 millennia. We watched Galen build an empire of explanation, black bile, melancholy, balance, so convincing it held medicine in place for 1,500 years, a prison built of certainty. Then we watched the prison crack, not because the enemy changed, but because our eyes did. Vesalius dared to trust the body more than the book. Morgani anchored disease in organs instead of spirits. Virchow looked down the microscope and saw the betrayal, cancer as our own cells, breaking rules, multiplying into anarchy. That was the first true turning point. Once cancer became us, the war could not be a simple border defense. It had to become a careful civil response, precision without self-destruction. And still, for a time, the war remained brutal. The knife, then the beam, then the drip. Surgery, radiation, chemotherapy. Weapons that often won battles but did not end the conflict because metastasis moved like smoke through a house. Present even when you could not see the flame. We watched chemotherapy rise from trenches and poison clouds, from mustard gas and secret trials. We watched Faber force the first remissions in children's leukemia with antiphalates. Temporary, costly, but real enough to prove the principle. We watched the nation declare war with legislation and money and deadlines that biology never promised to honor. Then we watched the true enemy reveal itself in code, oncogenes and tumor suppressors, accelerators stuck down, brakes cut through. We watched prevention win a campaign against tobacco, not with a new drug, but with the grinding power of data and policy and truth repeated until it stuck. We watched patients step out of silence and become advocates, forcing systems to move faster, to listen, to treat people as partners rather than passive bodies. We watched targeted therapy deliver its clean miracle, one orange pill turning a once fatal leukemia into something many could live with. We watched immunotherapy finally vindicate an old heresy, that the immune system is not blind but often restrained, its brakes exploited by tumors. We watched checkpoint blockade produce durable remissions that used to be impossible in metastatic disease. And then, because cancer is never content with our applause, we watched it adapt again. Heterogeneity, resistance, microenvironments that function like fortresses, metastasis as a logistical masterpiece. So what do we say at the end of a story like this? Not "we have won." That would be a lie. Not "we are helpless." That would also be a lie. The truth sits in the narrow space between. The future is not one cure, but a set of moves. The future is earlier detection that is good enough to matter and careful enough not to harm. Liquid biopsy as surveillance, yes, but paired with wise interpretation so we do not turn every whisper into a war. The future is precision medicine that treats the actual engine of a tumor, not the name of the organ it grew in. A shift from category to mechanism. The future is combinations designed not just to attack, but to prevent escape. To anticipate resistance, the way chess players anticipate an opponent's next 3 moves. The future is engineered immunity and cell therapies that behave like living weapons, capable of persisting, adapting, learning, but also capable of collateral damage if we forget that power is not the same as wisdom. The future is gene editing used with discipline, humility, and strict boundaries, especially when the temptation to improve the human body starts sounding like public health instead of ideology. The future is machine intelligence used as a tool, not an oracle. Augmented doctors, not replaced doctors. Algorithms audited, validated, held accountable. And the future is also, quietly, stubbornly, prevention. The least glamorous and most effective form of medicine. Policies that reduce smoking and environmental exposures. Vaccinations that prevent cancers driven by specific infections. Screening programs that actually reach the people most at risk, not just the people most resourced. The cost question we cannot avoid, because here is the part that rarely gets told in grand narratives. A cure that exists only for those who can access it is not a cure, it is a privilege. The most advanced therapies, genomic profiling, engineered cell treatments, some targeted drugs, often require specialized centers, expensive manufacturing, and systems that many communities do not have. Even within one country, access can look like geography and insurance status more than medical need. So part of the war is not waged in laboratories at all. It is waged in policy, infrastructure, and ethics. In who gets screened, who gets referred, who gets the newest drug, who gets a clinical trial, who gets a second opinion, who gets palliative care early enough to matter. This is not a side issue. It determines who lives long enough to benefit from breakthroughs. What it means to live with an ancient adversary, cancer, forces a kind of honesty that modern life often lets us postpone. It reminds us that our bodies are not machines built to last forever. They are living systems under constant repair. And repair is never perfect. The seed of error is the price of renewal. But knowing this does not strip life of meaning. It changes what meaning looks like. It means the goal cannot always be never again. Sometimes the goal is not this time. Sometimes the goal is caught early. Sometimes the goal is held in check. Sometimes the goal is years given back. Sometimes the goal is pain eased. Sometimes the goal is simply not alone. If the war metaphor promised a final victory parade, the truth offers something more durable and less theatrical. A long peace built in pieces. A disease that, in many cases, can be turned from a sudden ending into a managed condition. A future where recurrence is detected before it becomes a takeover. A future where the emperor is not worshipped or feared in silence, but watched, contained, and disrupted whenever it tries to rebuild. Our last word from the Forbidden Dispensary. We began tonight with whispers in bone. We end with a quieter kind of hope, one that does not depend on fantasy. Hope that comes from seeing clearly, from refusing to fight ghosts, from learning that the enemy is not one thing, and therefore our response cannot be one thing either. Hope that comes from the fact that every era of this story, every century, every breakthrough, every painful mistake, shows the same pattern. We do not win by pretending cancer is simple. We win by admitting it is complex and refusing to look away anyway. So we close the cabinet for now, not because the story is finished, but because you have enough for one night. And if you tell us where you're listening from and what time it is where you are, we'll take note, quietly, like we always do, of how far this voice traveled, and how many people, in how many places, are still here, still breathing, still listening, still fighting in their own ways.